Cihad nedir? Cihad savaşmak mıdır?
So last time we talked about the historical critical method. Now I'm applying the historical critical method when it comes to the topic of jihad or the ethics of war and peace in the Quran. So the first point that I'm bringing up is that there is a disjuncture or a disconnect between what the Quran was saying to its original audience and what the medieval exegetes or the classical exegetes said of the Quran on this topic. This is something that Western historical critical scholars have long talked about. If you want to read something good on this topic, I suggest Nikolai Sinai's. It's an article on when did the Quranic rasam reach closure. It's a two-part article. This is at the end of the first part, or his first article on this topic. There he talks about how Western scholars have long noticed that the early Muslims did not seem to interact with the Quran as much as one would expect. And so this is kind of what he calls the hidden scripture model, where even though the Quran closed relatively early, dedicated exegesis of the Quran, there was actually a delay in that. The Quran initially was used for more ritualistic, liturgical purposes. It was used in a symbolic way, and it was even used in a talismanic way. That is to say, as a object of ritual purity, sacredness, and power. And this is not too dissimilar to how the Quran is often used today by many Muslims, or historically, where the Quran is something that you kind of read, when you have somebody passes away, then you kind of read the Quran, but it's not something that you actually read and try to derive your laws and ethics from. That's not how Muslims have generally used the Quran. And especially in that early period, that was not the case. So what Western historical scholars, starting even all the way back to Joseph Schacht, have recognized is that Islamic law originated independent of the Quran. And then the Quran, at a later point in time, the law had to be read back into the text. And there are many examples that you could look at for this. The most obvious example is the idea of stoning adulterers. Why is it that Islamic law developed that when that's at divergence with the Quranic text? Well, the Quran says to lash them or house imprisonment. It doesn't say stoning. So then that had to be justified back into the text. And that's why certain heavy hermeneutical tools were used in order to do that, because you already had this corpus, this scripture that was fully formed, but now you had Islamic law that was kind of independent of that. How do you read that back into the text? That's where my scholarship comes in. I just finished this really large article. It's very long, unfortunately, but I'm just finishing the footnotes and then I'm going to submit it. It's on this very topic in which I look at what are the exegetical strategies or the hermeneutical tools that the medieval or the classical exegetes used in order to read the Quran on this topic of jihad. And what I find is that they're not deriving the law from the Quran. That's what their stated methodology is that, okay, the initial sources are the Quran and then the Hadith or the Sunnah, and then from those we derive the law. This is how the traditional scholars portray what they're doing, but when you actually look under the cover or under the hood, that's not really what they're doing. If you want to read a little bit about this, I suggest looking at Behnam Siddiqui's book, The Logic of Lawmaking in Islam. He proposes that what actually happens in reality, we should invert that model. It's the reverse process. I'm using Behnam Siddiqui's approach or his framework to he looked at the Hadith, I looked at the Quran, and I argue that it's even more applicable when it comes to the Quran. Why? Because the Quran was already a closed text. Because it became a closed text relatively early on, this meant that the classical scholars had to use even more heavy-handed exegetical tools in order to kind of jam the law into the text. Whereas with the Hadith was still kind of amorphous and open-ended to some extent. And so you could just generate different Hadiths. That's why on almost any legal topic, you'll find all these conflicting Hadith. Why? Because they're trying to justify the law in the text. And the hadith, you could just say the Prophet said, and there you go. But you couldn't do that with the Quran. And because of that, the only thing that you could do is use these heavy-handed exegetical tools. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to push back against this idea that we read the Quran through the lens of the Islamic tradition or the exegetical tradition. There are many Western scholars have pushed back against this. Gabriel Reynolds at the University of Notre Dame is one who has written on this topic very recently, and I agree with him. He argues that there is this disjuncture between the Quran in its original context and the classical exegetes. He points out, for example, that the classical exegetes are often confused or don't even know what a certain word in the Quran means. This means that there is not this kind of unbroken chain of transmission between the Quran and these exegetes, but rather there is this kind of departure or disjuncture. For example, the classical exegetes don't know what the disconnected letters are. They just kind of are guessing or speculating what they could be. Meanwhile, for example, they don't know who the Sabaeans are. They take different guesses, and what you see is contradictory and conflicting opinions on. They are engaging in the same sort of speculation that modern scholars would be engaging in. So from that standpoint, Gabriel Reynolds is arguing, and I agree with him, that we should push back against this idea that the classical exegetes were in a privileged position compared to us modern scholars. Traditionalists will often argue that we should, if we want to access the Quran, we have to access it through the exegetical tradition because they were simply closer to the time of its revelation and they had access to this privileged information. That is, the exegesis that was done by the Prophet and the companions, which was then transmitted to the classical scholars. This is a purely religious idea, and if you want to hold it for religious reasons, you can hold it. But as a critical scholar, I don't think that this is very convincing. In fact, what we see is that many early figures, for example, Ibn Abbas, they are many different conflicting opinions are ascribed to them. And these are, in a sense, they are ascriptional figures only. These are later scholars who are back projecting ideas and concepts onto these early figures, and thereby showing this kind of continuous chain of transmission that is not really historical. It's fictional in some sense. And so what I'm trying to say is that we need to read the Quran on its own terms. And many modern or modernist Islamic scholars have argued for this. Fazl Rahman was a famous example of this, that we need to read the Quran on its own terms. And that means reading the Quran with fresh eyes. That means not just jumping to the exegesis and then reading the Quran through that. So, for example, there is the Study Quran, which is a very popular resource that every Quran class that I've taught, students are encouraged to use the Study Quran. Now, I think the Study Quran is an excellent translation of the Quran, and from that perspective, I actually use their translation. I also think it's an excellent resource for academics or researchers. It's a first stop shop that you can look at, and you can see what the different opinions of the classical exegetes were on various verses. But I think you do yourself a disservice if you jump to that as your first stop before you actually just read the Quran on its own terms. The classical exegetes used a very atomistic approach when they read the Quran. That is, and they would even use what I call a sub-atomistic approach. They wouldn't even read an entire verse together. So oftentimes they would interpret a word in one way in one passage, and then the same word in another passage that's just like maybe two verses down in a completely different fashion. Now, it is true that a word can sometimes be used differently. However, it's often not the case when they're interpreting this way, and you'd think that they would actually analyze this verse. The reason is they would read the Quran in this kind of linear atomistic fashion. They would trudge from one verse to the next verse. They wouldn't read the Quran in a holistic or thematic fashion. And so that's where modern scholars, many modern Muslims, have gone in an opposite direction and have said that we need to read the Quran in a holistic manner or even a thematic manner. That is, if you want to know what the Quran says on war and peace, for example, then you would compile all the verses on war and peace and analyze them together and analyze them in the context that they appear in the Quran itself, as opposed to, for example, reading it in a linear fashion and then seeing, okay, what does this exegete say? What does this exegete say? Also, so these are the kind of exegetical strategies that the classical scholars would use. I argue to, quote, piously manipulate the text. Piously manipulate, I use the word piously because this isn't some conspiracy. They weren't kind of evil-minded in that sense. Rather, they thought surely this is what God intended the text to say. And so they would use these strategies to kind of move the Quran to what they thought God must have meant when he said such and such. So, for example, when it comes to jihad, there are passages in the Quran that say if the disbelievers cease in, and it's implied cease in their hostilities, then God is most forgiving. However, I show how the classical exegetes would read this and say, wait a second, how could God forgive the disbelievers when it comes to shirk and kufr? Surely he cannot forgive that. And therefore, this is not talking about ceasing hostilities against the Muslims or the believers. Instead, it's about ceasing in their shirk or their kufr. And so they had to move the text from its most obvious or intuitive meaning to something else because they had this theological or legal imperative in mind. So they would use different hermeneutical strategies in order to, what I call, piously manipulate the text and move it in this direction. So atomization was definitely one factor that allowed them to do this, because if you're viewing the Quran as kind of just these bits of disconnected material, it's much easier to move it around and manipulate it in a way that will be conducive to whatever your legal or theological imperative is. There was also what I call superimposition. That is, you impose another text onto the text. So the most obvious superimposition is the imposition of the hadith canon onto the Quran. Because the Quran is now a closed text, well, you need another text, the hadith, that you can superimpose. So for example, when it comes to stoning, stoning is not in the Quran. But what you can do is you can say, oh, let's say there's a hadith. There's a hadith that says, oh, there was a so-called stoning verse that was abrogated in the Quran, just its recitation, but its legal ruling still applied, and therefore stoning is the actual punishment. Well, how do you do that? You superimpose the hadith onto the text. When it comes to jihad, I show how they superimpose the hadith, for example, where the Prophet has said, I have been commanded to fight the people until they declare, la ilaha illallah, etc. By superimposing this text, they actually, and I show this in my article, they invert the meaning of the Quranic text, because the Quran actually says, fight them until there is no more fitna. Fitna, I show, means religious persecution. That is forcing someone to believe against their will. But what this hadith is actually doing is inverting it. It's saying, fight them so that there is fitna, or religious compulsion of the unbelievers. So there's a complete inversion of the Quranic text. The other things that you can do is you can gloss the text. Sorry, just one second. You can gloss the text. You can interpolate words into the text. So for example, the Quran says if they cease or desist, then you can add kind of in brackets shirk or kufr and change the meaning of the text in that way. You can also recast the text. That is to say, a certain verse of the Quran says, do not aggress, for God does not love the aggressors. Well, this verse is clearly talking about initiating hostilities. But what the classical exegetes, many of them would say is, this verse is talking about aggressing against civilians. So then you shift the text from what's called jus ad bellum, that is right to wage war or initiate war, just cause, and you shift it from just cause to just conduct, jus in bello, and say that's what it's actually talking about. And so you divert the meaning of the text away from something that would contradict your legal or theological beliefs, and you move it in a direction that's more consistent with it. So these are some of the strategies that the classical exegetes use that I'm problematizing. I also show how the text is inert to the law. That is to say, the law is, I mixed that up. The law is inert to the text. So, for example, one scholar would say that a verse means X, Y, or Z. And another scholar would take an opposite opinion and say, no, it actually means something different. Now, you'd think that they'd come to a different legal ruling, but what you actually find is that they come to the same legal ruling. How? Because one scholar, for example, will say, this verse means that you cannot aggress against unbelievers if they don't attack you first. Well, they'll say, if it means that, then this verse is abrogated. The other scholar will say, no, it's not abrogated. It just means don't aggress against women, children, etc. It's talking about conduct. It's not talking about just cause. So what you find is that no matter which interpretation you take, the legal result is still the same. You're still affirming the offensive jihad doctrine. And so this is kind of a heads I win, tails you lose situation in which no matter what the text is saying, the legal or theological result is the same. And so what I'm showing is that they're not deriving the laws or the theology from the Quran, but rather they're imposing it onto the text. And so that's what my scholarship is showing. Ultimately, to answer your question from the very beginning, I am showing that the Quran itself does not advocate offensive warfare, but rather only self-defense. And the unique contribution that I do. So there are many modern Muslim scholars who have argued for this idea, but the unique contribution that I do is, because I situate the Quran in its original historical context, I show that it's consistent with tribal warfare, which is actually much more egalitarian than the later imperial warfare of the classical exegetes. And so the unique contribution I show is I link jihad to qisas, which is the law of talion, that is, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. The Quran only allows or sanctions retaliation and equal retaliation based on this principle of qisas, which existed in the pre-Islamic tribal period. The Quran affirms this and limits retaliation to proportionate response. The other unique thing that the Quran does, in addition to this, is it links fitna or religious persecution to qisas, because it argues that if you compel someone away from the true religion, that's actually worse than killing them. Because by converting and by apostatizing away from the true religion, they're actually giving up the life of the next world, which is actually much worse than giving up the life of this world. And so that's kind of the unique contribution of the Quran. So what I do is I link jihad, qisas to jihad, and say that only retaliation is allowed. And so you're only allowed to retaliate against harm or insult, or defend religious freedom, which is against fitna, basically. And that's why the Quran says, fight them until there is no more religious persecution. So that, in a nutshell, is my research on the topic of jihad.